In the archery world, there is sometimes a need for a tool called a drawboard to help in getting a compound bow set up perfectly. If you're part of my usual audience, you're probably asking yourself, well, why do I care about this? Well, it's not the finished project that you should be interested in, but the process I used in getting to it. I developed some brand new skills and dusted off some very old ones along the way. If you're a fellow archer tuning in to see how to make your very own drawboard, I've actually included 2 different versions. The first one is very utilitarian. It's not pretty, but it only takes about 7 minutes and a little more than about $20 to make. The bread and butter of this video is the second and abundantly classier version. I wanted to make an over-the-top drawboard that wasn't just a tool, but a piece of art that I could display proudly. No matter which one you prefer, this should be fun to watch. Let's get to it. Alright guys, so to make the basic version of a drawboard, this is really all you have to get the job done. You have to have your 2x6, you get a 3/4 inch pipe flange, you get a 3/4 inch piece of stub pipe that fits into that flange, you need a carabiner that's a high weight rated one, not those silly little ones you get with water bottles or whatever, and then just a lightweight like a boat winch. This is all you have to have. If you want to get carried away, you can take like a ruler or an old measuring tape or something and one of these turnbuckles so that you can dial in the draw length a little bit more precisely than you can with a click at a time on the winch. Start out by attaching the pipe flange towards the front of the board. Exact placement doesn't really matter, but shoot for center. I also drew a perpendicular line that I tried to line the front-facing edge of the threaded hole on. This will transfer to the front edge of the stub pipe, and that's where you'll want to start measuring from if you plan to attach a ruler. Once the flange is bolted down, thread in the stub pipe and make sure it's tight. Then, if you're adding a ruler, you'll want it directly behind the post. So measure from the line we drew earlier to some distance behind the flange pipe and mark a line. I went with 3 inches. Remove enough of the ruler so that it fits behind the flange, then line it up with your mark and attach it. Screws or nails will last longer, but I just used a staple gun. Moving to the other end of the board, just mount the winch to it with some long screws or lag bolts. You'll want to place it as close to the center as you can get without the handle running into the side. Front to back positioning depends on your board and personal preferences. If your board is too long, it'll be hard to move around and store it. If it's too short, it might not have enough length for all the possible draw lengths as well as the hardware. And that's it. You'll want to put some kind of padding over the pipe and flange to keep from scuffing up the grip on your bow, but other than that, it's ready to work. There's nothing fancy about this version, but it'll get the job done. Now let's move on to version number 2. Everything about this one is completely unnecessary, but I decided I wanted something a little classier than just a winch on a board. I started by picking a nice piece of black walnut and running one face over the joiner to take the twist out. By the way, this is the first time I've really used my new joiner. It's 8 inches wide and has a helical head. I would consider both of these details luxuries, but now having used them, there's no way I could go back to a straight bladed 6-inch. This thing is a beast. I also ran one edge over the joiner to get a 90-degree corner. Then I flipped up my planer and ran the opposite face through it to bring both faces into parallel. I kissed the last edge with the blade of the table saw to give me 4 square corners, then removed some checking from one end with my radial arm saw, bringing it to final dimension. There were a few cracks and knots in the board, so I taped off the bottom, then mixed up some epoxy with just a drop of black dye and poured it in. Once the epoxy cured, I used a hand plane and a card scraper to flatten it back out. I measured and marked the location for the front post. I also used a compass to draw out a curve at the front just for aesthetics. I drew a line to indicate where the ruler would start, and made sure to take it all the way to the edge to make lining up the bit in my x-carve a little easier. With the board clamped down and the program all set, I just pushed play and stepped back to watch. And speaking of the program, I did a fair amount of experimenting to make sure I got the look that I wanted and the scale was exactly right before carving into my nice piece of walnut. The web-based software that drives the x-carve is called Easel, and it has an app built in that allows you to take a shape and create inlays with very little effort. In my case, I designed a custom ruler in Adobe Illustrator, then exported an SVG file. I uploaded that file to Easel, ran it through the app, and told it what tolerances I needed for the inlay. I'll explain the tolerance part a little later, but with the design and cutting paths all worked out, I let the machine do the work while I moved on to another part of the project. I jumped over to the metal lathe to start working on the front post. I wanted to avoid the big ugly flange like you saw in the Utilitarian version, so I came up with an alternative. I turned down one end of a piece of steel bar stock to create a shoulder, then I drilled a hole into the end of it.
Are you gonna take a video of me?
So Emmett, what are we working on?
I don't really know. Maybe metal?
Next, I knurled the surface to create a slightly grippy texture. Near the end of the pass, a shear pin that had 20 years of work under its belt broke in my lathe and disrupted the auto feed, so I had to finish it by hand. It made the knurling a little ugly, but that doesn't hurt the part any. I tapped threads into the hole by hand, working slowly and backing up frequently to clear the chips. During this process, I learned a good lesson about thread taps. I bought a brand new tap just for this job, and I struggled to make it work. It turned so hard that I thought I was going to break it, and I started wondering if I was working with some kind of hardened steel or if I drilled my hole too small. On a whim, I found my grandpa's antique tap set, and it had the same size tap in it. I figured I would test the old one and not feel bad if it snapped off. It cut like a dream. Lesson learned, not all taps are created equal. This is one place where I'll make sure to buy the best in the future. Back at the X-carve, the walnut board was finished, so I pulled it out and dropped a maple board in its place to start cutting out the puzzle pieces. I didn't want these pieces to pop loose and interfere with the bit, potentially breaking it, but I also didn't want to deal with hundreds of tiny tabs on the little numbers and hash marks either. The solution was to use a thicker piece of wood and to not carve all the way through it. I'll show you how that works a little later. With the maple board in the capable hands of the robot, I jumped back to working on the walnut-ear side of things. I drilled through holes in the back end to mount the winch, then those holes got enlarged from the bottom with a Forstner bit, just deep enough for a nut and washer to be recessed in. From the front end, I drilled a small through hole so I could identify that exact spot from both sides of the board. Then, I carefully drilled a hole the exact diameter and depth as the smaller shoulder I cut into that post earlier. Flipping the board over, I drilled a larger diameter hole to create another recess for a big washer and the bolt head. Then, I enlarged the through hole for the bolt to fit. At the bandsaw, I cut off the rounded corners that I marked earlier. Then, standing on end in my bench vise, I used a belt sander to perfect the curve and a palm sander to smooth it out. On a smaller piece, I would have done this on my stationary belt sander, but this board is too heavy and awkward to hold on that platform very well. I used a small roundover bit around the top edge of the board. This was also my first time using my new cordless trim router, and it worked great. Small, easy to control, and no lack of power. This isn't an ad, by the way, I'm just that excited about it. So now the walnut board is tuned up and the X-carve is done cutting on the maple board. I put a piece of painter's tape on the face of the maple board, making sure that it covered at least part of every single piece in the board. Then I set the fence on my bandsaw to make a cut about the same depth as the pieces. With a feather board in place and proceeding slowly, I resawed the maple board, cutting all the numbers and hash marks free, but keeping them contained by the tape. I carefully peeled back one end of the tape and stuck it down to my workbench. From the opposite end, I started peeling the tape back until all the pieces popped free and were held in place in order. It makes a cool sound too. No muss, no fuss. I was pretty tickled with myself for this one. Next, it was time to put together one of the easier puzzles I'd ever done. Earlier, I'd mentioned that I did a bunch of testing for this inlay, and right away I found, quite by accident, that I liked a little wider tolerance between the pieces and the walls of the pockets. This allowed me to use a black glue to fill the gaps and create a shadow effect that I really liked. One thing I tested was mixing epoxy with black dye, then filling the pocket completely and pressing the piece into it, allowing the epoxy to squeeze up and out. I figured this would be the easiest way, but after sanding I found that it left me with more air bubbles than I wanted, and the dye had bled into the light-colored maple. I found that the results were better using black CA glue. This stuff was runny enough that it flowed into the gaps easily, then I could force it to set up before it could bleed into the maple by spraying accelerator on it. With all the glue dry, I ran the board through my drum sander to bring the pieces and the glue flush with the board. While the pieces were still proud of the surface, they made a great sound going through the sander. I finished sanding the surface up through 220 grit with my random orbit sander, then set up a little spray station in my garage to throw on some satin polyurethane. I ended up putting on 2 nice, even coats, then left it overnight to dry. I mounted the winch with the harder-to-reach bolt already in place, then got the nut started on the underside. Then, for easier access, I stood the board up in my end vise to install and tighten the rest of the hardware. I flipped the board end for end, then put the metal post in place and secured it through the bottom using a big grade 5 bolt for its superior strength and a lock washer to keep it from backing out. I needed a way to hide that ugly steel post while also padding it, so I got a hold of my good friend and fellow podcast host Bruce to see if he could help me out. Bruce has some pretty serious skills when it comes to working with leather, so he used his laser to engrave and cut out a thick piece of leather. Then he used a corset stitch to pull the 2 ends together and create a sleeve. When this little detail arrived at my house, it was gorgeous. It fit like a glove. Thanks for the help, Bruce. To literally cap off this project, I turned a hunk of black walnut on my wood lathe into a small dome with a stem on it. After putting finish on it, I pressed it into the hole in the top of the post. Well, there it is, guys. Two completely different versions of the exact same tool. One that's quick and easy and cheap to make, one that's a lot more complicated, but it's also a lot nicer and something that you're going to want to hold on to and maybe pass down to your kids at some point. Now, it's beyond the scope of what this project video is to explain how and why you would want to use a drawboard on your bow. I'm not here to be a bow tech and teach you how to do that. There's lots of videos on YouTube that explain how you use this tool to set up one of those. So I'm going to link to some of the better ones I found down in the description. If you want to look into it yourself, I would start there. I want to say a huge thank you to Inventables for making this project possible, because there's no way I could have done this great inlay without the x-carve machine. Trying to do this by hand wouldn't have happened. So that CNC machine that I call my robot just does a great job. I also want to say thanks to Bruce, because this leather sleeve just turned out amazing. And I'm really impressed that we can be 2 time zones away. I can send him a few texts that said, this is what it needs to be and this is the size. And it came in a week and it was perfect. So thank you, Bruce. All of his links are in the description as well, so go check him out, go follow him. He's a great guy. And speaking of links, all of the tools, all of the materials, the glues, the finishes, I'm going to have links to all of that down in the description. So you should be able to just go start clicking links, and by the time you're done, you'll have everything you need to make one of these for yourself. So that's really about it. I hope you enjoyed my very unnecessary walnut project. Speaking of unnecessary walnut, if you want a t-shirt, there's a link to that too. That's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.